Hello and welcome to today's session on private network. I'm Hima Kadia from TeckNexus. Today we have Lirian joining us from OneLayer. OneLayer has been making significant strides in private network security domain. They recently won TeckNexus Award for Excellence in Private Network Security, second time in the row. Lirian, thank you so much for joining me today. Before we start our conversation, I would appreciate if you can start with a brief introduction.
Sure. Thank you very much for having me, Hema. My name is Liron. I'm leading system engineering at OneLayer. A little bit about OneLayer. We started the company to set up a very tailored solution for this emerging domain of private LTE and 5G networks, with the goal of making sure that this network can be as secured as they should be. I think over the years, and I'm sure we'll talk about it a lot today, we've learned that there's a lot of components to private LTE security, ranging all the way from understanding which assets you have connected to making sure that you can set up rules for them, to detect some anomalies, to all the way to making sure that your entire ecosystem can be aware of all these cellular assets that you have connected. So OneLayer is definitely doing a little bit in everything, right? Like we're making sure that the solution that we're developing is always in line with what we hear from the market and addresses these needs of the private LTE networks that we see.
Thanks, Liren, for the introduction. Let's start with the big picture view. How do you see the current state of private networks and what are the opportunities that you foresee?
I think we're all looking at this entire market for a few years now, and every time we feel like it's exactly on the verge of blowing up and seeing tons of network everywhere. I do think that generally speaking, we definitely see a growth. A lot of the customers that we already have the OneLayer solution deployed at, I think when we originally deployed the solution, like let's say a year or 2 years ago, it was maybe in one site, like for a specific factory following a successful POC. But now we see more scale. We see them realizing that this POC worked, that there's good use cases and money saved that they accomplished with this POC, and they're expanding to additional sites. And similarly, we expand with them. So I think that's one thing that's very obvious, that some customers of ours that we know have had private LTE already in one site are now expanding to additional sites. And the other things I'll say is I think there's specific markets and verticals. Utilities is a good example, where there's already a lot of really good success stories and tons of others that follow up. I don't remember who exactly told me that, but one thing I really liked is that one of the people I work with in utilities told me that in this market, nobody wants to be first, but everybody wants to be second. I feel like it's very true here because like now that we see that the private LTE network, in their cases, it's usually LTE, supports all these different use cases. We see more and more adopters. So like when I go to utility conferences, for example, I see tons and tons of different utility companies in exploration phase, trying to really understand like how exactly it can support their organization. So generally speaking, I would say that from my perspective, it's looking good. It looks like a lot of organizations are either in the adoption phase or expansion phase.
So, in this evolving ecosystem, what role does OneLayer play, and are there any specific opportunities that OneLayer team is targeting?
It sort of varies depending on what's the stage of the network of the prospect that we're talking to. And why is that? I feel like when we think of the pain points that a prospect has when their network is still tiny, so when they're still evaluating use cases, when they're still trying to understand what's the benefits of the technology, usually OneLayer serves more of a sort of like an inventory management tool to tell you, hey, these are all the different devices that you have connected. This is how you'll be able to track them. If, let's say, their identities change, if their location change, if SIMs are being swapped from one device to another. So a lot of information that relates to like standard daily operations. I think that for these other customers where we see scale, right, where it's no longer about like, call it 100 devices or less, but rather like 1,000 devices and more, this is where we see some other questions being formed. Like, perfect, now that I have a lot of devices, how can I provision and activate tons of themes automatically and associate them with the profile in a way that it's scalable? How can I, for example, make sure that the alerts that I have that relate to the network reach my alerting system where I see other alerts that relate to IT or OT? How can I have this information in my databases where I acknowledge all of my devices? So they have issues that are much more about, I guess, when you have massive information, when you have a lot of data, when you need to be able to make sure that everything is in sync. So I see both, I guess, depending on the stage of the prospect.
Thank you, Lyrian, for that overview. Let's move on to the next question. Can you give us some examples of successful deployments, achievements, and some of the industry collaborations?
In the fully functional sense, a really good use case that we have a success story that we publish is our story with Evergy, which is a utility company in the US working from Kansas City. And in their case, they were looking at basically their main issue right now with the network was being able to provision and activate hundreds of SIMs at a time. And not only to do that, but to understand the exact profile of each SIM that they activated. So once they had that SIM up and running, to understand that SIM was inserted into a Sierra wireless device versus that one that was inserted into a 4RF device. Where are my devices? So all the way from provisioning basically to really having an understanding of the different devices that are running in the network. And I think the provisioning phase was the most critical for them because when we were talking to them, they're running an Ericsson core in their case. And when they needed to provision, let's say, hundreds of devices at a time or hundreds of SIMs at a time, the process was super manual and wasn't very good for error handling and required the attention of the RF engineers instead of being something that is much more simple, therefore allowing their RF engineer to deal with more, call it, critical topics for their network. So when we were able to automate the entire process of provisioning for them and to ensure that it will be basically with a click of a button, just upload a file and all the SIMs will automatically be provisioned and can be delivered to the field, it very much hastened their process of onboarding from the moment where they get the SIMs to the point they can reach their destinations. And that was crucial for them. So that was number one, I think.
Mm-hmm.
The other use case worth mentioning, which I think is also quite neat, is we've had cases in the manufacturing domain where we were actually extending segmentation groups to a firewall, basically making sure that we were looking at tags that the customer was doing. So they were saying, for example, hey, all of these devices, they will be level 2 devices. And I don't want level 2 devices to be able to communicate with level 3 devices or level 4 devices, basically making segmentation in their network. And what we were doing is we were monitoring all the different network identifiers associated with these devices and pushing it to a firewall, therefore making sure that their enforcement mechanism that they had there can actually run effectively and account for all of these changes so that they really can segment devices regardless of whether their IP changes, their SIM change. If anything happens to these devices, we kept track of it. So we kept pushing that information to their enforcement tools.
Thank you, Liren.
Of
Liren,
course.
one of the key things that we notice in the private network domain is the partnerships. We think that partnerships are key, both from scalability perspective as well as a long-term success perspective. So can you elaborate on some of your key partnerships, whether your joint go-to-market strategies, specifically any technological collaborations and so on?
Yeah, of course. I would say that the number one most important partnership for OneLayer would probably be the core vendors,
Mhm.
mainly because the way our solution operates is by having a back and forth and querying these networks, these core vendors often. So think of it, if you have an Ericsson network, OneLayer will collect a lot of information from your Ericsson core. If you have a Nokia core, we will collect information from your Nokia core. Therefore, this relationship is first and foremost technical because we need that relationship in order for our solution to work. But also from a go-to-market perspective, I think that one of the really great things for us that we started working on in 2024, and it will definitely be there for us in 2025, is all about how we can leverage this relationships, not only for technical reasons, but also as a go-to-market tool. Because now we finally start seeing Ericsson pitching out the OneLayer solution to customers that have issues with identifying the state of their devices. Or alternatively, I can tell you that Nokia, for example, they're working on their Mixi program, which is a solution they have in place to simplify the addition of new applications over their NDAC core, the most frequent core that they use. And OneLayer is now supported via Mixi. So basically, it will allow customers to sort of just download OneLayer with the click of a button and enable it for their Nokia core. So these are two examples, but I think it's true for all the core vendors. Like it's all about how we can leverage these relationships so that we can reach more customers, so that we can have more, opportunities to expose the solutions in various verticals.
Thank you, Lirian, for those insights. Moving on to the next question, we definitely see that the private network market is going to grow significantly in the coming years. In that context, do you see specific trends that will be shaping the market? And how do you see OneLayer preparing itself to address those trends and changes?
It's a good question, and I would say that the most crucial role of OneLayer in this trends discussion is to make sure that the existing ecosystem, even prior to cellular, so looking at the organization, their network that they already own, their IT network, their OT networks, the system that they have in place in these networks, be it to manage their assets, be it to see rules, be it for authentication purposes, so that all of these tools can fit and operate as one ecosystem with the cellular network. In many ways, I tend to tell people that I think a good way to position OneLayer is some sort of a broker in that sense, because our software, on one hand, can communicate directly with the cellular core, right? So we can collect information in real time from the core, but we can also communicate with all of those standard IT and OT systems. And I gave some examples when we spoke, but I think it's all about how we can make sure that everything is working in harmony, right? How can we make sure that an onboarding process for a SIM can start in a system that's like a standard ticketing system, and an alert that relates to a specific device will propagate all the way to your Splunk, maybe, where you monitor other alerts. So I think one of the trends that is most crucial to me is to make sure that we can have everything connected in a more efficient way. Everything that it will be much more of a seamless process to connect your cellular network to your existing environment.
Thank you so much, Lilian, for sharing your insights and showcasing the incredible work that OneLayer team is doing. Before we wrap up our call, are there any specific points that you would like to highlight for our audience?
It's a great time in general for private LTE networks. I mean, I know it's probably something we tend to say often, but I really do see this growth that we started speaking on, like when we started this conversation. I really do think that partnerships are crucial here. Being able to rely, be it on system integrators, be it on advisors, be it on other technological vendors, I feel like it's the beauty of an emerging domain, because there's so many things that are still developing as we speak. I can tell that the pace of change that we have in a company like OneLayer is frequent, and it's not because we don't know what we want to deliver. It's because there's so many different things that we want to be able to deliver. Seeing these changes in front of our eyes constantly always forces us to adapt. And I think that without having very strong partnerships and being able to rely on one another and understand from each other what's the feedback you actually get when talking to customers, what pain points they bring up, it will be impossible. So for me, it's all about making sure that we keep this ecosystem working together and engaged, so that this entire, I guess, domain of private LTE can keep on growing the way that it currently does.
Thank you, Liran. Thank you again for taking time to speaking with me. And again, congratulations for winning the TeckNexus award, and wish you a continued success. Talk to you soon.
Thank you, Emma. Appreciate it so much.